Okay, welcome back everyone, and great to have you with me again. Welcome to History with Mr. Roberts. So in the last video, we looked at the fall of France and we looked at the efforts that Churchill made to keep France in the war against Nazi Germany. Now this video is going back to 1940 and we're going to look at one of the most controversial decisions Churchill ever made in the war. It was a decision that Churchill hated having to make, and it's still controversial today. So what we're looking at? We're looking at Churchill's decision to sink the French fleet at Mers El Kebir in French Algeria in July 1940. So we're going to look at what happened, why did Churchill make this decision, and what was its lasting impact. Okay, let's take a look. So on the 10th of May 1940, German forces launched Operation Case Yellow and invade Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and then France. Army Group A under General Rundstedt invades through the Ardennes forest, surprising the Allies. German units pushed towards the French coast and trapped the Allies in the Dunkirk pocket. Later they moved south towards Paris, and the French government flees to Tours and then Bordeaux, where on the 22nd of June they seek an armistice. The Allies, having first fled from Dunkirk as part of Operation Dynamo, then flee from Le Havre, Cherbourg and St. Malo, and finally from the Atlantic ports of Brest and Saint-Nazaire as part of Operation Ariel. Allied forces leave behind tanks, supplies, petrol, and huge amounts of weaponry. France is left in total chaos, with 6 to 8 million refugees still clogging the roads and sharing with retreating French troops and the invading German armies as they sweep down towards the rest of France. With Hitler now in charge of the French Atlantic coast, the threat to Britain is serious. Churchill knows that before the fall of France, the Kriegsmarine were largely limited to Norwegian waters and the Baltic. But now they have access to the Atlantic shipping lanes from French ports such as Saint-Nazaire, Brest, Lorient and Bordeaux in western France. Churchill knows the danger the U-boat fleet poses to Britain's import lifelines, especially from Canada and America. Churchill is even more worried when you factor in the huge French naval fleet and its capital ships that are under the threat of seizure by the German and Italian navies. Such a seizure would leave the Mediterranean Sea and Axis Lake surrounded by Italy, accessed by the German Navy, and of course Francoist Spain. It would also pose a danger to Gibraltar and to the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to the rest of the empire. Now, knowing this, the French admiral Francois Darlan promises to prevent the French fleet from falling into German or Italian hands, and he makes this promise directly to the British government, but Churchill is really nervous. Churchill suspects that Darlan might not be able to keep such a promise if those higher up the chain in Vichy France change strategy, especially with discussions around creating a new European order. With that in mind, Churchill and the British cabinet approved Operation Catapult, a mission to seek French naval surrender or risk destruction. He appoints a British Admiral, James Somerville, to lead the task force, Force H, out of Gibraltar. The British task force, made up of capital ships such as the Hood and destroyers, leaves Gibraltar, and the next day, 3rd of July, arrives off the port of Mers El Kebir near Oran in French Algeria. It's here that James Somerville sends a message to the French Admiral Genso, giving him a set of options to consider and an ultimatum. Somerville informs Genso that the French have several options. The first, they can surrender and join the British task force and sail out of the harbour. 2, they can sail back to Britain with reduced crews to ports such as Portsmouth or Plymouth. Number 3, they can sail to neutral waters, such as in the United States or the West Indies, or they can scuttle their own ships. Now, of course, Somerville makes clear that failure to comply with any of these within 6 hours would result in a regrettable but an all-out assault by British ships just outside the harbour wall. After 6 hours of Genso's attempts to contact Darlan without success, the French decide to resist the British assault. With that decision, shortly before 6 p.m, the British forces open fire. Let's take a look. The attack lasted only 20 minutes. The French ships were mostly stuck in the harbour and were really easy pickings for the British gunners. Many were still at anchor despite the British 6-hour warning. Capital ships such as the Bretagne sank very quickly. Now, the biggest tragedy was that over 1,100 French sailors are killed and hundreds more are injured. The Strasbourg battleship, as you can see from this map, makes a dash for it and managed to escape, heading back to Toulon in southern France. However, the mission overall for Britain is a success. The British combined the attack with the seizure of French ships in Britain, Alexandria in Egypt, and the bombing of the battleship Richelieu in Dakar. The British returned a few days later to finish off the attack, sadly resulting in the further death of another 150 French sailors. Reaction back in Britain is divided. On the French side, Charles de Gaulle, who now represents the Free French in exile, is saddened but not surprised by Churchill's audacious move. He is obviously upset at the loss of so many French lives. He knows also that the collaborationist government in France will use the event to play up anti-British feeling. The British government benches are resolute, however, in their conviction that it was the right and only decision possible. Back in France, Marshal Pétain and Vichy authorised the severing of diplomatic relations with Britain on the 5th of July 1940. The extreme fascist right in France launches a series of anti-British propaganda. Two examples of which we can see in this picture now. The first shows a British bulldog eating the world and references British attacks on France yesterday and today, raising questions to the viewer about which French interests Britain might attack next. The other poster very simply says in French, which translates as "never forget Oran." Not content with just anti-British propaganda, Admiral Darlan convinces Pétain to launch a revenge attack on Britain. And on the 24th September 1940, French planes take off from bases in North Africa to attack Gibraltar, causing extensive damage to the port and the facilities. Despite French anger and the desire to fight back, France eventually scales back its actions in the Mediterranean, leaving the British less worried about the threat to Gibraltar and its control over access to the Mediterranean Sea. In addition to removing the threat to Britain, the attack impressed the American public, and here, as we can see, President Roosevelt. In sinking the French fleet, Churchill had proven beyond any doubt that Britain would not surrender or seek terms, but would instead fight on. It also concentrated the minds in Washington on what scenario they would face should Britain, and with it its navy, fall to the Germans. From the British perspective, it was a terrible but the only decision possible. So what have we learned in this video? Well, the first thing is that with the defeat of France in 1940, Churchill was really worried that the Germans or Italians could seize the French navy, and especially those capital ships, the big battleships. Now, Admiral Darlan of the French Navy had promised the British this would not happen. But of course, Churchill was really worried that he might not be able to keep that promise. Maybe people above him in the political arena in France would make a change of decision possible. Now, with the Germans now controlling the Atlantic ports, the danger grew even bigger, and Churchill was really worried about that. Now, of course, Germany could now send its U-boats into the Atlantic shipping lanes, and essentially the Mediterranean became an access lake with Italy and Germany and potentially Francoist Spain controlling access to the Mediterranean. Now, Churchill made the decision to launch Operation Catapult on the 2nd of July, and on the 3rd of July, Admiral Somerville arrives leading Force H at Mers El Kebir to present that ultimatum. Now, despite the number of options given, including surrender, scuttle or sail to neutral waters, the French decide to resist. After 6 hours, at 6 p.m, the Royal Navy opened fire. Now, the attack is devastating. Over 1,100 French sailors are killed and over 370 are injured. Now, in response, France severs diplomatic relations. It later bombs Gibraltar. But for Churchill, he hated making the decision. It was one of the most upsetting decisions he had to make during the war. But essentially, he did it to remove the threat posed by the French Navy going over to the German side, and also to strengthen domestic resolve in Britain, especially within his own government, and also to show Roosevelt in America that Britain would continue the fight. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you like it, please press the like button, join in with some comments below, or subscribe, and please send it on to anyone else you think might be interested. So we've covered a lot of videos so far on World War II. We've got plenty more to come. We've got Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's failed invasion of Britain, and of course the Battle for Britain. How did Britain survive and fight alone against Hitler's war machine? We've got plenty of other videos coming up on other topics. Henry VIII, the break with Rome, the Spanish Armada. Okay, until next time, take care.